In the last video, we discussed the coverings of the heart as well as its positioning in the chest, and I didn't really go into much of the structure of the heart, and that's actually quite planned. It's a little wise. All I talked about was that this was the apex of the heart, this thing down here. Apex of the heart is pointing towards the left and is laying more predominantly in the left side of the thoracic cavity. Now, the reason why I didn't discuss about the structures is because it's a lot easier to talk about these different structures based upon the trace. If you were to pretend that you were a blood cell going through the blood vessels and meeting and oohing and awing about all the wonderful little structures that we're going to see as we go through the heart. Before we begin this activity, I need to hit a couple of points. First, when we're looking at somebody straight on, we're looking at the anterior of the heart. That means the directions of the gentleman or gentlewoman, in this case gentleman, we are going to look at it oppositely. So if I am holding up my left hand and I'm extending it out, I'm going to touch this gentleman's right hand. If I'm holding out my right hand, I'm going to be touching this gentleman's left hand. If I were holding it out straight out. That's the same thing with the heart. The directions are on opposite sides. If we were to look at him posteriorly, then it would be our left side is corresponding to the left, his left heart, and our right side is corresponding to his right side of his heart. Note number 2, we're going to follow a blood cell through the heart. I'm going to say, oh, you're in the left atrium, this gets constricted, it moves on to this ventricle, and it gets constricted, and it shoots out blood into this. Please, 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 please note that the two top chambers contract at the same time. A little while later, after the two chambers contract, the two chambers below, the bigger, thicker ones, contract at the same time. So when I am going through the heart as a single blood cell, I am just viewing it as that, but make certain that you remember that the two corresponding chambers, the top ones constrict at the same time or contract at the same time, and the two bottom ones contract at the same time. So without further ado, let us begin. First off, a couple of general terms for the chambers of the heart, nice and easy. Remember, the chambers are, if you're nice and fancy, I wish I was nice and fancy, I'm not quite nice and fancy. You can refer to a room as a chamber. Please enter my chamber, gentlemen, as we discuss the matters at hand. Red blood, that's why we are calling the spaces inside your heart chambers. So the top two chambers are called atrium, or plural atria. The bottom chambers, the bigger, the thicker ones that you're noticing that the muscles are quite thick, are called ventricles. You will also notice about the ventricles that there is a very meaty section that's dividing the two. This is called your septum. And this right here is your septum, dividing the ventricles. A lot of important electrical events occur there in order to get your ventricles working. Not just a barrier. So top atrium, bottom ventricles. Something to note about the ventricles is that they are not built the same, and that is for very good reasons. The left ventricle, you'll notice here in this picture, is very thick. Its myocardium is very, very thick. The reason why it really has to do a lot more work in order to get its job done. The left ventricle has to push blood out to the body, which means it has to fight against a larger volume of blood to make the blood flow. The right ventricle only has one place to go. It's pushing deoxygenated blood through an artery up to your lungs. It's a lot more spacious, but it probably doesn't do so well at pushing as much blood as the left ventricle does. With that, let's go ahead and put into our minds how blood is going to flow through the heart. You'll notice that I've placed a number 1 in this top chamber right here. Again, you should remember that this is an atrium. It is on the right side. So how you're going to say it is, you're going to call it the right atrium. So the right atrium contracts, or you flow through this little white flappy thing called a heart valve. We'll give specific names here in a little while. And you go into this next chamber. It's a ventricle. Again, it's on the right side, so you're going to say it is the right ventricle. When the right ventricle contracts, the flappy thing that you just passed through, that valve, shuts, and the blood that's inside the ventricle is forced up and out, and that leads to your lungs. The right ventricle leads to your lungs, which means it is pushing deoxygenated blood to your lungs. Your blood gets to your lungs, carbon dioxide goes away as you breathe out, oxygen comes in as you breathe in, and after it's done its happy-go-pukey thing, it comes back to the heart on its left side. Again, remember that that top chamber is an atrium. It is on the left side, so you're going to call it a left atrium. Your atrium contracts, forcing blood past the valve and into this chamber, which is a ventricle. It is on the left side, so you're going into the left ventricle, which is a lot meatier, which then, when it contracts, pushes blood out through this valve and out to the body. So those are the chambers of the heart. Let's go ahead and add on some extra detail. We will be talking about the valves now. Notice that the two valves in between the atrium and the ventricles are labeled with a AV, while the valves at the top are labeled SL, and that is an abbreviation. AV stands for atrioventricular valve. It's a general term given to these valves. Take a guess why it's called atrioventricular valve? Well, top chamber is called the atrium, atrio, and the bottom chamber that it's separating, the ventricle, ventricular valve. Kind of straightforward, atrioventricular valve. Again, because it is dividing the atria from the ventricles, AV. The semilunar valve sort of makes sense. Why is it called the semilunar valve? If you take a look, it kind of looks like a crescent moon. If I were to move this SL, you would notice that it is cut down by a frontal plane, and it has sort of a crescent moon to it. It has a semilunar valve, or a semilunar look to it. You will notice that these are quite cup-shaped. What happens is, if your ventricle contracts, shoots blood up, but that blood is going to eventually go, you know what, I really miss home. It's going to come down, and it's going to get caught in these little cups, and it's going to seal up this valve and not allow blood back into the ventricle from the body. The only way blood's going to come back in is through that atria again, or into that ventricle is through that atria again. Now, how, pray tell, do we make certain that the AV valve actually does what it's supposed to do? If you take a close look, you'll notice that it has the one on the right has 3 valves to it, or 3 flaps. These 3 flaps, you're going to notice in a little while, are attached to cords, which cords are attached to a muscle. The valve on the right, the atrioventricular valve on the right, is called the tricuspid valve. Again, because it has the 3 flappy things. 1, 2, 3. 3 flaps. Tricuspid. The one on the left is called the bicuspid valve. Bi means 2. Another word for the bicuspid valve, another name I should say, is the mitral valve. Let's find out why it's called the bicuspid valve. Let's see here. 1, 2. Yeah, okay, that makes sense. That makes sense. It has 2 valves. So the one on the left is called your bicuspid valve, and the one on your right is called the tricuspid valve. One quick note, the bicuspid valve is the most likely to fail. If you're in a yearbook, you would not want that term, but the bicuspid valve has earned that in his yearbook. Yay! Again, it's two flaps trying to fight against a very strong current that is generated by your very strong, very meaty left ventricle. As well, it's just two flaps working on it, while the other one has the three flaps, which all the cords and the tendons that are attached to it sort of help out in keeping it strong. I had mentioned cords, I had mentioned a couple of things of holding it together. This is what I'm referring to. This is more of the anterior aspect or the anterior look of these valves rather than from above, like we were looking for at the beginning. You'll notice that the flaps or the cusps kind of look like parachutes. They also have these nice little cords that are being, again, attached to some gentlemen to hold and make them taut. In this case, these chordae tendineae are attached to a papillary muscle. When you're letting blood in, the papillary muscle is relaxed. When you're trying to when blood is when your ventricle is being contracted, those papillary muscles become strong to help hold taut those cusps. Another student recently actually said it looked like a jellyfish, and I fully agree. If you're to look at it that way, the bicuspid valve, the head looks like the head of the jellyfish. These tendons or these cords right here are sort of called the little stingers, and maybe these little papillary muscles kind of look like the fish that it's caught. You will notice that these tendons or cords are called chordae tendineae. Now, forgive me, I love Canadians. Canadians are amazing, but this is sort of the way that helped me remember it. It sounded like sort of two Canadians discussing what to call this. They're like, "Oh, forgive me for my terrible accent. Oh, what about?" Yeah, it's a terrible accent. What about the cord and what about? It looks like a cord, eh? No, it looks more like a tendon, eh? Why don't we just put the two words together? It looks like a cord, eh? Tendon, eh? Cord, eh? Tendon, eh? Yeah, forgive me. Canadians, you're amazing. I love a good I love a good gravy on my French fries. Again, chordae tendineae kind of look like the strings to the parachute, or again, the tentacles that is the jellyfish. The papillary muscle would be the corresponding fish stuck in the tentacles, or the gentleman that is making certain that that line is nice, that his weight is making that line nice and taut. So all valve parts, again, are anchored to a fibrous skeleton. If you're remembering, it goes into the endocardium, which has a nice fibrous network. You don't really want this valve loose, or else life is not going to end very well for you. Let's go ahead and look at the semilunar valve naming. This one is actually kind of, well, straightforward. First off, we need to understand where blood is going to when we're contracting the ventricles. This one, the left ventricle, when it contracts, it goes into something called the aorta. That's the arch thing right here. Again, the aorta will feed blood to the rest of the body. While the valve on the right, the semilunar valve, is feeding into your lungs. Another word for lungs is pulmonary. Anything that corresponds to lungs is pulmonary. So take a guess what this semilunar valve is called. It is called the pulmonary semilunar valve. Why? Well, you're pumping blood towards the lungs. This semilunar valve is called the aortic semilunar valve, or just aortic valve for short. Why is it called the aortic? Well, because right beyond that, the semilunar valve is the aorta, and it is pertaining to the aorta, and anything pertaining has the aortic suffix or prefix, aortic semilunar valve. With that, let's go ahead and put in that new information that we have into this tracing. That is the blood cell looking through, having a good time looking through the heart and taking its pictures. Again, we're going to go ahead and start off in the right atrium, number 1. Blood is coming in through these vena cavas. These are the blood vessels that are bringing blood back. You also have another spot that we'll be talking about in a little while. That gets fed into the right atrium. The right atrium, if you're a blood cell being escorted through the heart in an appropriate way, will then pass through this valve right here. It is between the atria and a ventricle, so it is atrioventricular, and it has 3 flaps, so it is the tricuspid valve, or the right atrioventricular valve. After passing through this right atrioventricular valve, tricuspid valve, it goes into the right ventricle. The right ventricle contracts, forcing the tricuspid valve to shut, and then opening up the semilunar valve. The semilunar valve's appropriate name is called the pulmonary or semilunar valve, because again, you're shooting blood up into the lungs from the right ventricle. You go up into the lungs, you do your CO2-O2 exchange, and you come back down, and you go into this chamber, the left atrium. The left atrium contracts, it forces you past this left atrioventricular valve, which is also called your bicuspid valve, or another one that they might call it is the mitral valve. You get past this bicuspid valve, you get swirling around in the left ventricle, and then your left ventricle contracts, forcing this AV valve to shut, meaning that any and all blood now has to go through the semilunar valve to get out. The name for the semilunar valve, again, is your aortic, because you are passing through the aorta and out onto the body. Okay, real quick, right atrium, tricuspid, right ventricle, you go into the pulmonary, semilunars, you go into the lungs, you come back down, you go into the left atrium, you go into the left atrium, you pass through the bicuspid valve, or aka the mitral, into the left ventricle. The left ventricle then goes up into the semilunar valves that pertain or head on out to the aorta, so it's the aortic semilunar valve, and out onto the body. So another note, I've already mentioned this once upon a time, make certain you remember that arteries carry blood away from the heart. Arteries carry blood away from the heart, while veins carry blood into the heart. It doesn't matter if you're oxygenated or if you're deoxygenated. These arteries always carry blood away. Remember that the right ventricle is pumping blood away from the heart and to the lungs. Is that blood oxygenated? No, it's deoxygenated. Is the blood returning to the left atrium deoxygenated because it's passing through veins? No, because you're returning from the lungs, which have just reoxygenated, or oxygenated, I guess is the appropriate term, the blood, and is sending it back to, or is being brought back to the heart. One important note to remember is that the arteries are very elastic because it has to deal with those very strong contractions, while the veins really don't see any changes in pressure. The only pressure it sees is when the heart starts re-pulling back and acting like a syringe and forming a negative pressure. So let's talk about these real quick. Let's call them what they are. The one that is coming off your right ventricle and up to your lungs is called the pulmonary trunk. Again, it carries that blood to the lungs. Your aorta is carrying blood to the body. We kind of talked about this already, so I'm not going to waste too much time on that. The veins, however, are kind of sort of important to remember. First off, you got the superior and inferior vena cava. That is returning any and all blood from the heart minus the lungs and the blood that's actually going to the heart after by itself. There is another place that is bringing blood back from the heart, or the outside of the heart, and it is called your coronary sinus, and it also does go back into your atria. It's not, that red dot isn't perfectly placed as to where the coronary sinus comes back in, but it is extremely worth noting because we'll talk about this again. The blood inside the chambers, the atria and the ventricles, do not give the appropriate nutrients that the heart needs, or the myocardium and all that stuff needs. You have to come out and go around. We'll talk more on that later. The pulmonary veins, take a guess why it's called pulmonary. You probably already said it. It's because blood is returning back from the lungs to the heart here. With that, let's throw in these numbers. So first off, number 1, you got the vena cava. You got a superior one because it's coming from above, and an inferior one because it's coming down from below, as well as you got the coronary sinus coming on in. You go through the right atrium, tricuspid, right ventricle, pulmonary semilunar valve, and out through the pulmonary trunk, which leads to the lungs. You come back down. It's coming back from the lungs, so guess what? These veins are called. They're named after the lungs. They are your pulmonary veins. You go through the left atrium, bicuspids, aka mitral valve, through the left ventricle, passing through afterwards into the aortic, past the aortic semilunar valve, and out through into this major blood artery, the aorta. We are not going to do that all together. I will let you all do that. But let's do a quick application. So muscle failure. Chambers expand. When they expand, they form a negative pressure. That's sort of the reason why blood kind of wants to come back through the aorta, back to the ventricles, as well as back from the pulmonary trunk and back into the ventricle. And those semilunar valves go, no, no, that is not okay. You cannot come back in. But there is a place where they can draw from. You'll notice that I have little syringes because when you draw something up from the medicines or from what have you for a vaccine, you are creating a negative pressure when you pull that plunger. And when you pull that plunger, you can draw up liquid. Same thing with the heart. When the heart starts relaxing from its contracted state, you start sucking things in like you do with a straw. So the question is, if muscles stop to work, if these cardiac muscles stop working because a myriad of reasons, maybe a valve has gone bad, maybe there's a clog on the outside not letting your heart get the nutrients that it needs and it dies off, so bad muscle tissue, you're going to start getting blood pooling up. The question is, depending on if you get edema in certain parts of your body tells you which part of your heart is failing. And how you know that is, remember, the heart, the chambers of the heart are acting like straws, drinking from where the blood is coming from. So if your right side of your heart is failing, that means you're going to get blood or liquid building up in your body because the vena cava, guess what? It's drawing or is bringing blood back from the body. If your left side of your heart is failing, you're no longer getting that straw action going on from the ventricle, which means it's no longer drawing blood from the lungs, which then you get a super congestive problem and you get edema, pulmonary edema, or liquid in the lungs. Now, if you get the valve failure, again, it's weak, you start forming blood and pool in the issues. If it's in the left, again, it's hitting up your pulmonary circulation. I hope this helps you. Good luck. I believe in you. And remember, you got this.